Hey everyone, and welcome back to the complete history of World of Warcraft, our series that will chart the entire game's life. Today's episode heavily relies, of course, on our previous episode, patch 1.4, the Call to War, that introduced the legendary honor system, so be sure that you also watch that. Gather your warband because Battlegrounds have been released. Just over a month on from the previous player versus player patch, this latest release was definitely a companion patch, and on the 7th of June 2005, Blizzard introduced the rest of the PvP feature set for Vanilla World of Warcraft, bringing instance 10v10 and 40 versus 40 combat to Azeroth. Patch 1.5, Battlegrounds finally offered PvPers a designed experience, something that their PvE counterparts had enjoyed since launch. Thing is though, these launch Battlegrounds, well, they were quite special. And by special, I mean rough, really quite rough, but their lack of finesse created amazing gameplay opportunities. The meat of this patch was the introduction of Warsong Gulch and Alterac Valley. Each battleground represented a different aspect of the war in Azeroth, with each having uniquely defined mechanics and world building, offering up new parts of the world, immersing players in the lore-defining conflict between the Alliance and the Horde. To enter these battlegrounds, you actually had to travel to their entrance portals, located in their respective zones, something that greatly added to the fantasy of going to war, a fantasy that was also added to by how you would find masses of fellow players setting off to war with you. Alltrak Valley saw the venerable Frostwolf clan pit against the Stormpike dwarves. Tensions had arose when the Stormpike expedition, backed by Magni Bronzebeard's sovereign imperialistic imperative, settled in the valley in search of natural resources and clues to their Titan origins. But Alterac Valley had been home to the Frostwolf clan since the First War, when Gul'dan banished them to its snowy reaches for refusing to drink the blood of Manaroth. And rather than flee their home of 20 years, the Frostwolves chose to fight. This battleground was intended to be a player versus environment experience, with the zone not only being huge, but also being filled with a plethora of NPCs. This included a total of 36 quests across the zone, plenty to keep you busy, and an indispensable way to gain a few late game levels. It was certainly good to have quests to do, given the duration and scope of Alterac Valley, with average games lasting anywhere between 2 to 4 hours, sometimes even upwards of a whole day. The length of these matches could be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, kills became less worth the effort, as honor gained from killing the same character in a 24-hour period would actually slowly decrease with each kill. On the other hand, though, players got to participate in a form of competitive gameplay that was largely unique at the time, when the collective effort of your faction was matched against the enemies, and individual actions had consequences in the grand scheme of those hours-long matches. The whole thing was an incredibly immersive experience that really drew players in. It was a sure sign of the vanilla design philosophy of player-driven content, and made for some truly memorable combat, granting the Valley a sense of place that other battlegrounds would never achieve. Now, the primary objective was to kill the enemy faction leader. Every ounce of the war effort was put into myriad objectives that would all lead to that end. Each leader, Drakthar for the Frostwolf clan and Vandar Stormpike for the Stormpike Guard, resided in a fortress deep within their own territory, and players would have to fight through a gauntlet of mini objectives and localized skirmishes in order to claim their kill. Each faction would spawn in just beside the entrance of their keep, and immediately a raid group would have to be organized, as that was actually not an initial feature. Then everyone would wait with trepidation until the timer went down and your faction could flood out into the snow of the valley. Generally, the battle would begin with a mass charge towards the Fields of Strife, the no-man's land territory that divided each faction's area. This was a simply incredible experience as your raid group bounded past patrolling guards, archers keeping sentry at the top of the towers, and the bunkers that your enemy aimed to capture. Of course, in the original version, your enemy wasn't the only threat, as Korak the Blood Rager, a dire troll, patrolled the Field of Strife, lashing out at anyone who dared to come close. This charge built up the feel of the zone, and it really put you, the player, at the center of this titanic struggle. Just before the factions clashed, players could decide to run straight past the enemy and begin claiming objectives, or they could meet in combat. And it was at this point that the battle lines were drawn and chaos ensued, filling screens with a dizzying array of spell effects and tanking frame rates on 2005 computers. In the aftermath of this initial battle, as players were invariably being killed and spawning back at the graveyards, it was smart to take the initiative and begin claiming objectives. The first order of business was to slay the opposing faction's initial captains, Stonehearth and Galvangar, from the Alliance and the Horde respectively. They were positioned close to the field of strife, allowing victors of the initial clash to exploit their momentum, swinging the battle in their favor. Then each faction had 3 territorial objectives: towers for the Horde, bunkers for the Alliance. These were defended by archers and each had a commander. Now, managing the threat of the archers while still being conscious of enemy player activity was of the utmost importance as you cleared, claimed, and destroyed those objectives by holding them. Beating the other faction in this and in defeating their commander was an early sign of how the battle was going. And once the fight reached the enemy's fortress, well, a siege would ensue. Defenders would respawn as fast as they possibly could. They would try to go back there to shore up their defenses. If an assault was successfully repelled, the defenders would immediately attempt to reclaim the initiative and to strike back. Now, while this and the jockeying for graveyards will sound familiar to later incarnations of Alterac Valley, what sets patch 1.5 apart is everything else that impacted the fight, and the tuning of them such that they actually mattered, as there were 5 further ways for players to influence the war effort. When you killed a player of the enemy faction, they could drop armor scraps, and these could be turned in at your faction fortress to upgrade the armor of all your guards and patrols. Upgrading the patrols didn't just give them better numbers though, it actually changed how they looked visually, something that I think really invested players in the world and viscerally showed off their efforts. Then possibly the most glorious mechanic here was the cavalry charge. This was activated by ranging into the valley to tame or slay rams and wolves depending on your faction, and once you had sufficiently culled the fauna of the valley, you could summon in an elite unit of cavalry who would charge right to the enemy base, creating a massive window of opportunity for you and your faction. And seeing this NPC cavalry charge complemented by dozens of players was quite an incredible sight, absolutely evocative of the MMO feel. Then there was also an option for an infantry strike into enemy territory, and that was summoned by capturing one of the 2 infested mines and collecting the resources spawned within. Now, this objective was put in place so that players who were under-leveled or under-geared could still be in some way effective. The end of this increasing sophistication in battleground warfare was the Elemental Lords, a rare phenomenon only seen by the most coordinated of groups. The Elemental Lord was a raid-level creature that would tirelessly fight its way to the enemy fortress. The requisite quests took around an hour, after which the Lord would spawn and then stand idle in the field of strife for another 30 minutes before finally advancing. A long and arduous process, but surely a game ender. Now, if we're to talk about Alterac Valley, we definitely need to talk about the Alliance bias, and a good metric with which to examine this is the most deadly NPCs in Vanilla, which was judged by the sheer number of player characters killed. NPCs from Alterac Valley featured in 7 of the top 20 positions, with Drekthar, General of the Horde, holding the number 1 spot. We can take from this that A, Drekthar was clearly a hardcore guy, but that B, Alliance players had so many more opportunities to encounter him. We can therefore infer from this that the Alliance, through massive bodies, were winning in AV quite a bit more often. In fact, Vandar Stormpike was featured at number 15 on this list, with the guard archers defending the bridge at his base featuring at number 7. So here we really see more Horde players dying in their attempt to get to Vandar across that bridge rather than actually fighting him, with that area around the bridge being a significant sticking point for the Horde. This bias was exacerbated then with later changes that took much of the nuance from the Battlegrounds. Alterac Valley by the Burning Crusade became known as, in the player base's discourse, a simple case of Alliance Zerg rushing, but in 1.5, in the initial version, the heroic actions of player characters carried so much more weight, and so the Horde, although on the back foot, could prevail against the odds. After literal hours of grueling warfare, one faction would triumph and slay the enemy's leader, and this was an incredible feat, and throughout the community people have tales of glorious combat, or even of logging into Alterac Valley, going to work, coming back into the same Alterac Valley, and then continuing the fight, or even massive all-nighters spent in the valley, in really just an incredible slice of the game that only existed for a brief time towards the start of its life. Warsong Gulch was a more straightforward capture-the-flag game, but it was no less steeped in lore and tension. This battleground was a callback to the RTS franchise, as it represented the region in which Grom Hellscream began his campaign of deforestation in Warcraft 3. After an altercation with the Night Elves, the same altercation that actually introduced Night Elves to the lore, Thrall stepped in and stopped the deforestation, but, against the advice of the then Warchief, a band of orcs, aided by players, remained to continue cutting down the Ashenvale trees. The Alliance, on the other hand, would be forming up with the Silverwing Sentinels to defend the sanctity of the forest. Alliance players would spawn into the Silverwing Hole to the north and horde into the Warsong Lumber Mill in the south, with the Gulch having very interesting environment, with the verdant forests giving way to the unforgiving Barrens Desert, a visceral representation of the lore that drove this battleground. And across the battleground, several power-ups were placed in strategic locations, giving short but powerful boosts to speed and health regeneration. Generally, the plan would be to form a raid group once you came in, and then divide the 10 players into 2 groups of 5, one for defense, one for offense. So, if you were maybe a rogue, then you, a hunter, a mage, and a warlock, and maybe a warrior would strike out to the enemy base. And after initial skirmishing around the battleground, or simply just rushing past each other to the enemy's base, players were faced with the daunting prospect of claiming the enemy's flag. There were several ways into each base, but the majority of players would be funneled through the most direct route, the dreaded entrance tunnels. Players were squeezed into this tight, dangerous space where melee characters could unload massively punishing amounts of damage, and a well-timed psychic scream, howl of terror, or intimidating shout from the enemy could destroy any assault, no matter how organized it was. And while you could come into possession of the enemy flag, flags actually could not be captured if both sides were in possession of the other's flag. So when you had the enemy flag safely protected in your base, the strategy would immediately shift to trying to kill the enemy flag bearer. The first of 3 flags would win the match, with these matches being significantly shorter than Alterac Valley, with across these 2 battlegrounds, Blizzard providing 2 entirely separate gameplay experiences that would differently fit into a player's schedule, offering overall quite a varied experience for player versus player combat. Of course, in service of this new focus on player versus player combat, a lot of balancing happened, and Warlocks were the big win out of this patch's round of balancing, with 18 spells in their kit being improved, such as Demonic Sacrifice and Siphon Life now being instant casts. Several boosts to their demonic companions were also included. Now, these changes were largely geared towards PvP, as it was clear that Warlocks had been suffering against other players and also just had gameplay issues. A strong example of this was Blizzard giving Warlocks the ability to generate a soul shard through their honorable kills, something that clearly had not been considered before patch 1.4, when the idea of an honorable kill was actually introduced. It, of course, was vitally important to make sure that these simple bread-and-butter class mechanics actually worked and would transfer into a new battleground, so this was essential for the Warlocks. It was unsurprising, really, that every class received balancing in patch 1.5, as it was becoming apparent that abilities which seemed reasonable in a player versus environment context were just unworkable in player versus player. And speaking of honorable kills, it was now possible for you to score a dishonorable kill. You would do this by killing an NPC of the opposing faction who had a significantly lower level than you, and this was aimed to fix a low-level player problem where they'd return to a quest hub only to find that everyone had been slaughtered by a roving band from the enemy faction. This was, of course, a consequence of the thriving world PvP at the time, with locations such as the Crossroads or Darkshire being frequent targets. Of course, that's not all for the changes, with Azeroth itself being further developed, adding 2 mid to late game questing hubs. Searing Gorge got Thorium Point, part factory, part fortress. This was a neutral town from which the Thorium Brotherhood, a splinter organization from the Dark Iron Dwarves, operated. These dwarves had the same dark outlook of their erstwhile brothers and hired adventurers to sabotage the works of their trade and innovation competitors. Then the Raventusk village was added to the hinterlands, a mirror to the Alliance's airy peak that gave the Horde more content and reason to explore the zone. It was also an interesting example of Blizzard Blizzard effectively using the lore to build zones, as the Reventusk tribe are forest trolls who have fought alongside some variation of the Horde since the Second War. So, to tie it all together, patch 1.5 brought a range of updates aimed at bringing the war between the Alliance and the Horde to life. Working on the honor system established off the previous patch, it really should be seen as part 2 of World of Warcraft's PvP rollout. It set the stage for a design ethic that brought several more Battlegrounds and served as the foundation for all future player versus player combat. In the next episode of the complete history of World of Warcraft, we will see a patch more along the lines of what we've come to expect from Blizzard. A big, story-driven PvE content patch with a truly monumental raid at its core. So thank you for watching this video. This is one of my favorite things that we do. We've recently got a full-time writer working in this series, so it's been so much fun, like hopping between me and Jared working in the series, going through the scripts, researching all the patches, diving really into the old lore of the game. So if you'd like to help us out directly, you can check out the Patreon, where you can also get some really cool physical merch. And apart from that, all I can ask for is that you watch the series, share it with your friends, especially if you've enjoyed this one and you haven't seen the previous episode for patch 1.4, be sure to watch that, because it really goes into the honor system that really just predicates so much of this patch. So thank you very much for all of your support. I'll be with you soon for the next episode, and with that, I'll see you next time.